So, hello, everybody. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for this presentation. Mr. Rob Woolsey is a member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides, and he is also a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, and he will be presenting on one of the battlefields this evening. Thank you very much, Rob. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. As it was introduced, I'm a member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides and owner-operator of Woolsey's War Walks. And I do a lot of First and Canadian, Second World War battlefield touring and lectures and museum guiding now, in fact. And today, we're going to be talking about the Battle of Thiepval Ridge and the Battle of the Ancre Heights. These are First World War battles of 1916. So this year it's 110th anniversary of these actions, and they're significant because when we talk about the First World War, you've probably not heard of them, but they are part of the Battle of the Somme. And we've talked about the Battle of Courcelette before, specifically Courcelette, the Canadian battle, and the memorial there. And this is actually the continuation from that battle as we go forward. The first picture that you see here, that is actually of the fighting in and around Regina Trench, just outside of Courcelette. So, Military Family Services is not affiliated with any of the companies, apps, or products named in this presentation, and they don't sponsor, endorse any of the company's products or anything else that I mentioned in this conversation or in this presentation, sorry. So, what we're going to be talking about, some overview of the country. We're going to talk about recommended preparations, some travel advisories, things you need to be aware of, some helpful tips. We're going to talk about quickly the Battle of the Somme so we can frame what we're talking about, and then the Battle of Courcelette, which leads to the next series of battles. And Thiepval Ridge is a series of actions, and then the Ancre Heights, and then we're fighting over a couple of trench lines, which are quite serious. And so they're all kind of tied together, and we're going to use those maps today to kind of show you what they're like. The picture on this slide is a Mark I tank 1 year after the battle, knocked out at just outside of Courcelette on the 15th of September 1916 as the first tank attack. There's two soldiers that are buried there. They're likely either in Courcelette or Adinex cemeteries, but the clarity on the photo I can't actually tell you. But you notice how quickly the ground is repaired after 1 year. So we're talking about France, and specifically the Somme and Pas-de-Calais regions, because the battle actually takes place on the border of those two regions in France. Population, we're talking about 500,000 people in this area. Of course, the main language is French. The main airport is Paris Charles de Gaulle for international, although you can fly into Brussels as well. The main one in France, though, is Paris Charles de Gaulle. So the Somme is largely a farming area in northern France. It has several rivers, including the River Somme, which this campaign gets its name from. And this actually what split the battlefield in half between kind of roughly, some people say where the French and the English meet, but that's why it was there. But yes, it almost cuts the battlefield in half. It was devastated by the 141 Long Day Battle in 1916, and it was fought over again twice in 1918. There was two different actions fought over the same hunk of space. And it took until almost 1938 to clean up this part of the First World War Western Front. The cost of living in France, it's the 10th most expensive country in Europe, so it's higher than the average. Prices aren't terrible when you come to the Somme region, but it's still a fairly expensive country. Interesting about this part of the battlefield, it's littered with cemeteries and some amazing one-of features, including a large portion of the battlefield that's preserved, but it also has the largest memorial to the missing. And the missing on the Somme are at Thiepval Memorial, which has 73,000 British names missing just from the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And the 13,000 that didn't fit on that are at a monument called the Pausiers Monument, which is at the cemetery at the bottom of Thiepval Ridge. And it's quite an impressive monument, and you can actually see it from all over the battlefield. You can see the Thiepval Memorial. So, recommended preparations. The Somme is generally quite mild. It's got a mild climate with cold, wet winters and warm, dry summers. They're not hot, but they're warm. Best time to travel really is the end of April to the middle of November at the latest. I would argue that some years early November, you're pretty much finished because it's getting very muddy, gray, and wet. And also it's a farm region, so the farmers don't want you on the roads. A rain jacket is always a must to have on the Somme. You never know when the weather will change. It also helps break the wind. You also want really good footwear for walking, especially where we're talking about today, because it's all farm roads, tracks, and fields. Always have travel insurance. All the memorials all the cemeteries are child-friendly, and the one restaurant that's close to that, or the around town that has the only restaurant in the area, Pozieres La Tommy, is also child-friendly. And there's no city passes, unfortunately, because there's no real cities around. So travel advisories, always check out travel advisories for France. Um, it's important. There's no, of course, no entry restrictions for COVID. That's been lifted and gone away, except for those coming through China, supposedly. Um, Although I think that just changed recently. Visas and entry requirements, there's none from the EU, max 90-day stay from anybody coming from Canada. Security, petty crime is always a risk, but the Somme region is generally very safe. It's very rural France, so you have less of the problems that you would in a bigger city. But it's something to be aware of in France. Medical care, there is a hospital and Albert at one end of the Somme and Bapaume at the other. The emergency number is 112. You can also dial 911. They both interconnect. And the only embassy consulate in France is in Paris. So always dress for the weather. You're not that far from the sea, so it can be really chilly. Sometimes the weather will blow in quite quickly. The Somme is only about an hour and a half to 2 hours from the sea on a bad day and in traffic, so you got to be careful. Please don't climb on any monuments or memorials. That's exactly what they are. And some of them actually have ashes spread around them and they're considered consecrated. Also, you're visiting somebody's home. This is where they work and live. And to allow us to keep going, please kind of respect the property and parking. The French sometimes get quite frustrated when we're parking things in the wrong spot. So now this is important. Battles in this area were cleaned up after the war, but there are still many pieces of unexploded ordnance that come all out of the ground and litter these fields. Don't touch any of them and please stay away from them if you see any. They're becoming more and more unstable and therefore more dangerous. I'll give you two examples. This past fall, I was on the Somme battlefield with a tour, and just days before, a French farmer about a kilometer and a half down the road had hit a phosphorus shell and it went off and put 14 people in hospital, including his children, because it exploded. And he didn't even see it in his farm field. So that's something you got to be really careful of. Again, always great footwear. Some sites have stone paths, but almost everything else is grass or muddy fields or farm tracks. So you're kind of walking around terrain where you really need to have good footing. The picture in this one is a live shell. It's a British 18-pounder shell fired. It's actually on the Canadian start line. It's right beside the Courcelette British Cemetery. I always seem to find them there. It's something you need to be very much aware of. So the Battle of the Somme from the 1st of July to the 20th of September, 1916. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 was a very large campaign made up of three phases. Each within them had multiple little or smaller actions or battles. Overall, it was originally an ambitious plan with the goal of punching through the German front line quickly and reaching from Albert and getting to Bapaume in the first couple of days. It quickly bogged down into a slugging match where the casualties were enormous on both sides. An estimated 3 million soldiers fought in this action, and about 1 million became casualties. Opening on the 1st of July, 1916, with a disastrous result, the fighting continued through the summer. In the northern sector of the battlefield saw some of the toughest fighting and least progress. By the beginning of September, the Canadian Corps moved into the Somme region, taking over from the exhausted and badly depleted Australians around the village of Pozieres. So this is an overall map showing you the gains from the British and French overall during the entire 141-day campaign. And the colors up in the area by the village of Courcelette, there you'll see red, gray, blue, and all that. It's where Canadians were fighting. Canadian units fought and gained or lost ground. And that's the entire Somme battlefield right there. It's about 24-kilometer long front. The Battle of Courcelette. The middle of September 1916 saw the Battle of Courcelette, a victory for the Canadians. The fight was not fully over, though, as German counterattacks hoped to regain the village and the Canadians tried to push out from Courcelette. Neither side was successful, and only casualties mounted. So the Battle of Courcelette was actually tied to another attack, the Battle of Flers, which is south of us in this map. And the Canadians did this massive drive from just outside the village of Pozieres, only a little over a kilometer down the road, and then turned into the village and quickly stormed the village. It was a huge tactical success that knocked the Germans back quite a bit and drove them off the old Roman road that ran between Albert and Bapaume. And it was a really tough fight. Now, that all of that road system that you see here still exists today on this map. And it was quite a significant victory. In fact, some of the battalions that were holding Courcelette in the initial days after the battle suffered absolutely terrible losses. The 22nd Battalion, in fact, lost about 70% of its strength. And my great-grandfather's regiment, the 24th Battalion, which was holding the front line, launched an attack and lost 1/4 of its troops in about 2 to 3 minutes in an attack trying to get out of the village of Courcelette on the 17th of September. The attack on the Thiepval Ridge was meant to push the Germans off a high ground feature which ran from the village of Thiepval, which on this map is on the very left-hand side, through to an area just north of the village of Courcelette. The defenses were formidable and included the Swabian Redoubt, Zollern Redoubt, and the longest trench on the western front, Regina Trench. The Canadian Corps was on the right side of the attack, and it was to take Zollern Redoubt and push through and capture Regina Trench, while British Second Corps took Thiepval and the Swabian Redoubt. They had the support of over 900 guns, both heavy and field guns, and some 4-inch mortars whose job was to fire gas shells into the German, while every machine gun was to fire massive barrages over the attackers and into the Germans. The barrage was supposed to support the attack, was to move 100 yards every 3 minutes until it got to the German trenches, and then switch to 100 yards every 2 minutes. The attack at the Thiepval Ridge was also timed with an attack south of the Albert-Bapaume Road, later called the Battle of Le Transloy, which was to begin just as the last objective, Stuff Trench and Regina Trench, were captured. The connection to that battle is the Newfoundland Regiment, who are back on the Somme for the second time and have actually 2 memorials to the Battle of the Somme. One, of course, is Beaumont-Hamel, and the other is on the Le Transloy battlefield at Goudecourt. The Germans could not help but notice the buildup of the attack. Sitting on the high ground, they saw everything. They were well prepared with 144 deep dugouts, masses of wire, interconnected trenches that protected one another, and in some cases that were completely sheltered from British observation. The attack began at 12:35 in the afternoon on the 26th of September 1916, with the artillery firing and the infantry leaping from their assembly trenches and areas. The right-hand side of the attack was made by the 2nd Canadian Division's 6th Infantry Brigade and had 2 tanks attached to support them. The 28th, 29th, and 31st Battalions all moved off from the village of Courcelette, pushing towards the north and northeast in their attack. The 28th Battalion did not make it out of their trenches due to heavy German fire. The 29th Battalion reached the German line in 10 minutes and secured it, and the 31st Battalion was stopped from getting to its trenches by heavy fire from the defenders. Luckily, the section that was taken by the 29th Battalion was held in spite of German attempts to push the Canadians back. The left-hand side of the attack was the 1st Canadian Division commanded by Major General Arthur Currie, and he attacked with the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Brigades. The 3rd Brigade attacked was beside the 6th Canadian Brigade, leading with the 14th Royal Montreal and the 15th 48th Highlanders of Canada battalions, with help from the 16th Battalion of the Canadian Scottish. They succeeded in crossing the 400 yards to a trench line called Sudbury Trench, taking it and holding on to it until they stepped off again, this time at 1 p.m., reaching a connecting trench called Kenora Trench at about 2:40 p.m. The 15th Battalion was delayed due to a quick counterattack from the Germans, which they beat off, but were forced to reform in no man's land and thus had to fight hard to take their objectives, which they did. The 2nd Canadian Brigade had the 5th and 8th Battalions, each with an additional company from the 10th Battalion. They took fire from German positions on their left flank, but captured Zollern Trench, and they too paused and started at 1 p.m., and were once again successful in taking the next objective, Hessian Trench. They had contact with the 3rd Brigade on their right, but not with the British 34th Brigade on their left. The Canadians used grenades to clear down Zollern Trench, eventually building a barricade to hold the day's gains. And by 10:30 that night, a trench between Hessian and Zollern trenches, allowing the Canadians to move undercover, was completed. On the other side, the British 11th Division stalled with tough fighting to try to gain Zollern Trench and clear a feature called Monquet Farm, which the Canadians had failed to take in earlier battles. All the rest of the British attacks made progress, especially at Thiepval itself, taking most of the town. The morning of the 27th, it was discovered that the Germans in front of the 6th Brigade outside of Courcelette had withdrawn, and so they advanced through the German practice trenches, as they're marked on maps, to the northeast of the village, finally taking their objective. The 1st Canadian Division was counterattacked at Kenora Trench in the early hours of the 27th, and they were pushed out, but the Canadians countered with another attack, and they made their way back into it with tough fighting. At 6 p.m., the Germans attacked again, but with grenades, almost retaking the trench again. The 14th Battalion had held on, but soon fell back on their own to a support trench due to casualties, trying later that night at about 2 a.m. to take it, but failed to get back in. This was a very, very tough fight. A lot of the battalions that made it actually forward ended up getting pushed back in the end. They took huge amounts of casualties. This is a very much rolling countryside. And unfortunately for the Canadians, and if you get to ever walk this ground, you'll realize that they are completely exposed the entire time. There's not a tree forever. Like even in the villages, what would be left of them, there was no trees, there was no cover. Thiepval Ridge, the 28th, 29th of September. On the 28th of September, a Canadian light horse, the Corps Cavalry Regiment from the Canadian Corps, moved out with a patrol from the 6th Brigade lines, but it was hit by heavy fire and withdrew. The 6th Brigade then tried to advance with the 27th Battalion north up a place called Courcelette Trench, but they too were pushed back 3 times, and their third attempt ending at about 8:30 that evening. That night, the 1st Canadian Division's brigades were replaced by the 3rd Canadian Division's 8th Brigade and the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division's 5th Canadian Brigade, and the 4th Canadian Brigade replaced the 6th, all the troops rotating out for relatively fresh new troops. The Canadian 8th Brigade attacked at noon and captured one more part of Hessian Trench, but were pushed out and then got back in again with another counterattack. They were able to connect to the British division attacking on their left and assisted them by throwing grenades and clearing and gaining more of Hessian Trench. But the drive onto Regina Trench itself failed, with the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles falling back to their start positions and the 24th Battalion of the 5th Brigade being pushed back. This attack was a real stalling attack. They thought they would be able to punch through with fresh troops, and they literally hit the wall of Regina Trench. And what's interesting about Regina Trench is we're only not even a kilometer from Courcelette when this battle actually starts in places. What makes it harder is Regina Trench is actually hard to see because it's on the reverse slope side of a ridge. Now, the battle starts changing from the Battle of Thiepval Ridge because we clear Thiepval and we clear most of the features connecting to Thiepval. And now it switches to the Battle of Ancre Heights because where we're sitting and where we're attacking is actually trying to get to the river Ancre. The next phase on the Battle of the Somme was the Battle of the Ancre Heights, named for the river that cuts through parts of the battlefield. It lasted officially from the 1st of October to the 11th of November 1916, with actions taking place on the same ground 5 different times. On the 1st of October 1916 was launched a renewed attack towards Regina Trench. The 2nd Canadian Division had the 4th Brigade on the right, and they pushed successfully about 400 yards, connecting to the British on their very right. The 5th Brigade was still in line and attacked with 3 of its 4 battalions, the 22nd, the 25th, and 24th, on a frontage of about 1,200 yards. The 22nd Battalion was caught by heavy German fire about halfway to Regina Trench, and barely any men made it that far. Uncut wire forced those that did make it to withdraw. The 25th Battalion made it into another section of Kenora Trench farther up, but did not get any further. The 24th Battalion made good progress at first, until the unit on its left, the 5th Mounted Rifles of 8 Brigade's 3rd Division, was driven back by a German counterattack. The 5th Canadian Brigade held most of Kenora Trench that night, and in a series of outposts across the roads north of and into Courcelette Trench by nightfall. They were all connected with hard work and digging. By dawn on the 2nd of October, they were thankfully replaced. by a new brigade. The rest of the attack fell to the 3rd Canadian Division, and was also halted short of Regina Trench, with 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles fighting until 2 a.m. until they were forced to pull back. The Canadian outpost line was soon tied together and shortly connected, being only some 300 yards short of their objective. Scout parties went forward and reported that the German wire, while being damaged and destroyed in spots, and any gaps that were quickly created, were filled by heavy rolls of concertina wire being rapidly thrown into the gaps by the Germans. Bad weather set in, and any further action was halted. Now, this attack, the 4th Brigade, east of the town of Courcelette, was actually quite successful, but they also weren't trying to charge right towards Regina Trench. The units that were closest to Regina Trench coming out of Courcelette itself, specifically the 5th Infantry Brigade, suffered quite badly. The 24th Battalion actually took a real pounding in that battle and lost better part of another company of men. And when they came out, they marched out with 242 men off of that battlefield, one of which was my great-grandfather. Now, during the intervening week of bad weather, the 8th Canadian Brigade was replaced by the 7th and 9th Canadian Brigades of 3rd Division, and the 2nd Division was replaced completely by the 1st Canadian Division coming back into the line, with the 1st and 3rd Brigades taking over. At 4:50 a.m. in a terribly cold rain on the 8th of October, 1916, the 1st Brigade on the very right attacked with their 3rd and 4th Battalions, who took some more German trenches at a feature called the Quadrilateral. And they held it against the initial German counterattack. Later, a German sudden hurricane bombardment and a two-sided counterattack hit them as they were getting ready to resume the advance, and they were pushed back to their original starting positions after hours of heavy fighting and running out of grenades, losing some 770 men out of 1,100 who made the initial attack. To their left, the 16th Battalion of 3rd Brigade was hung up on the German wire, but forced its way through and took parts of Regina Trench. It was during this attack that Private James Richardson, a bagpiper, strode up and down in front of the German wire while under fire, playing his bagpipes, restoring the attack's momentum by raising the spirits of the attackers. He later took part in grenade attacks and clearing bunkers and trenches, and then was asked to help evacuate wounded Canadians and escort some prisoners. While he was moving back, he realized he'd forgotten his bagpipes, so he went back to get them and was never seen again, being reported as missing. He was finally recovered in 1920 when his body was found by a farmer. For his bravery in the battle, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, and today is commemorated at Adanac Cemetery, not far from where his action took place. The 13th Battalion, the Black Watch, had stopped before getting to Regina Trench after suffering terrible casualties, and eventually withdrew to their start line. The 9th Brigade's 58th and 43rd Battalions on the very left also failed to get to their objectives and suffered terribly. The 7th Brigade's Royal Canadian Regiment and 49th Battalions, though, made it into Regina Trench and started to clear it, only to be forced back. 2 days later, the entire Canadian Corps was withdrawn from the line and left the Somme to go to the Vimy Ridge sector. So this part of the battle had chewed up 3 Canadian divisions, and it's only a matter of 6 weeks of hard fighting. Now, the Battle of the Ancre Heights Regina Trench. The 4th Canadian Division came into the line under command of British II Corps, who had replaced the Canadian Corps, and took the very right-hand side of the line. They attacked on the 21st of October, and it went in with the support of some 200 artillery pieces, which caused heavy damage to the German trenches and wires. The 11th Canadian Brigade used the 102nd and 87th Battalions to take Regina Trench north of Courcelette, and they held on to it through 3 German attempts to dislodge them. On the 22nd of October, the 4th Canadian Division had tried to clear Regina Trench eastward, but they were stopped by heavy fire and heavy resistance. The Canadians paused as other attacks by the British began, but the 4th Canadian Division was back in action again on the 11th of November, when it was the 47th and 46th Battalions of 10th Brigade attacked the eastern end of Regina Trench, finally capturing that part of the line. So this is part of Courcelette battlefield. So Courcelette in this map is actually to the very left-hand side bottom You see North Practice trenches. Just below that is the village of Courcelette. And so we actually finally got onto this part of the battlefield finally. So this is the attack from the 46th and 47th battalions. They actually finally got through the trench line. Now, one of the reasons that was the case was the artillery fire and the battering Regina had taken from the middle of September to essentially the middle of November had essentially destroyed anything the Germans could do. It was under so much heavy fire. And that's the reason why this part of the attack was remarkably successful. The last big push by the 4th Canadian Division took place on the 18th of November, 1916. Attacking at 6:10 a.m., the 4th Canadian Division aimed at capturing two trench lines past Regina Trench, called Desire and Desire Support Trenches, just south of the village of Grand Court. The right side was the 10th Brigade, and the 46th Northwestern Battalion, otherwise known as the Suicide Battalion, attacked. Hampered, unfortunately, by British smokescreen and German fire, they were forced back. The 50th Battalion faced little resistance in their advance, but lost contact with the 11th Brigade, and while they took part of Desire Trench before being forced to pull back, while trying to hold on to it, they suffered immense losses. The 11th Brigade, though, did quite well. The 75th Battalion unfortunately veered off course in terrible weather, which was the only real setback, as the other units, the 54th, 78th, and 38th Battalions, plowed right into and took most of Desire Trench quickly. They sent patrols forward and found only a few defenders, and then captured a series of German outposts, capturing some 620 prisoners. The Battle of the Somme officially ends at the end of this action, not only for Canada, but the entire offensive has been called off. After 141 days and 425,000 British Empire casualties, the battle had broken the German army. In September of 1916, the German army had suffered 135,000 casualties, their worst month on the Battle of the Somme. At the end of November, specifically the 28th, the 4th Canadian Division left the Somme, moving its way north to join the Canadian Corps for the first time in the Thiepval Ridge front, marking the end of the battle for Canada. It was Canada's single most bloody campaign of the war, with over 24,000 casualties being suffered between the 1st of September and the 28th of November. Today, there's only one memorial to this battle for Canada, and that's at Courcelette, and that stands as a token of the bravery of the Canadian Corps on the Somme. There are some reminders, though, with the fallen being in 3 major cemeteries in the area. The first one is Courcelette British Cemetery, which is the yellow dot on the bottom of the map. You can see it from the Albert-Beaupalm Road. It has about 2,200 Canadians in it, including 2 16-year-old Canadians. One is George Ritchie from the Royal Canadian Regiment, and the other is Private Mackenzie from the Canadian Machine Gun Corps. It's here today rests where some of the start line positions for the battles after the Courcelette, i.e. Thiepval Ridge, begins. That gray X you see on the map is actually a Victoria Cross action from just after the Battle of Courcelette, but before the Battle of Thiepval Ridge, which is James Kerr's Victoria Cross from 3rd Canadian Division, 49th Battalion. The other place you can go see it is actually the cemetery on Regina Trench itself, which are the 2 dots. They're yellow and orange, marking each end of the Regina Trench cemetery, which is actually built on the German trench line of Regina Trench. Today, there's about 3,000 commemorations there, many of which are Canadian. You can follow a road out of Courcelette down a farm road, and many times when I've driven this road, I've almost driven on and parked on unexploded ordnance, and you're crossing the entire battlefield as you walk or drive down all of those roads. All of the roads on the map you see in front of you all exist today, and you can still drive them in most cases. The last place you can go to visit parts of the battlefield and see immensely well is Adirondack Cemetery, which is on the D107, not far from where Private Richardson's VC action took place. You can actually, if you look out across that field, it's in the middle of that field. But they're not the only 2 places. There are 2 smaller wartime cemeteries soldiers buried on the battlefield by their comrades, Grand Court Road, which holds one Canadian from 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles, and Stump Road Cemetery, which are only accessible down poor farm tracks and trails. Getting to Grand Court Road, you actually have to drive down a farm road, go onto a track, get out of your vehicle, and walk about 300 meters into the middle of a farmer's field where that wartime cemetery is today. Retracing and walking this ground can be quite spectacular. You just have to be careful of the farmers and their farm tractors and not to walk in their farm fields. But you can literally walk all the lines of advance of all the Canadian battalions down these farm roads. One of the most realistic and shattering parts of this battlefield is the iron harvest. The first time I came to this battlefield, I parked my bus beside a stack of unexploded ordnance that had been collected by the farmer, 3 feet high and 5 feet long. Time and again, I have parked on or parked beside unexploded shells, hunks of barbed wire pickets, metal sheets from dugouts and bunkers, and occasionally bits and pieces of soldiers' uniforms and shoes. If you're going to Courcelette and going to visit the battlefield, you must visit Latomie. Latomie is in the village of Pozières, which was the Canadian rear area for most of this battle. And he's got a phenomenal museum collection, including the ID disc of a Canadian, Sergeant Gwynn, who survived the battle but was later killed at Vimy Ridge as a PPCLI. My favorite place to go visit here is actually Regina Trench. Not only because my family fought there, but because when you get onto that trench, you can see the last bound up towards Grand Court and realize when you look back how little distance you had to travel. The Battle of the Somme is a huge milestone in this 110th anniversary, and we should always remember all of these smaller actions and not just the bigger ones. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, before I say that, this is Regina Trench. That's my truck parked on the German front line. And you see that little Canada flag, that's actually where the trench line is. And what you don't see in that photo, which is on the left, is the artillery shell. That's a 6-inch British howitzer shell that I originally parked my truck on by accident. But that's the type of thing you'll find on the Somme. And if you look in the photo on the right, that's overlooking the last bound of the battlefield. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for taking us on this powerful journey through history. Your knowledge, your passion, and the way that you bring these stories to life really remind us why remembrance matters and is important. So we're truly grateful for the time and care that you've put into sharing this history with us. Thank you so, so much, Rob.
Not a problem. My pleasure.